Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Lockdown. And today I'm joined by Professor Rosie Campbell, who is a professor
Lovely.
of politics at King's College London. Rosie, how are you and where are you right now?
I am well. I am in Epsom, which is a town just outside of London in England. And it is snowing, which has caused quite a lot of excitement in my family. Yes, so I'm in my family home where I have been for the last year.
Okay. This is, I think, episode almost 20 of the lockdown. And this for you is lockdown number one, two, or three?
This is full lockdown number three.
Four. Okay, three. Okay. I was
Yeah.
speaking to a friend from the UK the other day, said, lockdown one, we're all very nice to our neighbors. Lockdown two, we all learned to make bread. Lockdown three, we're all looking at each other like, we're kind of part of the Gestapo or something and inquisitive, aggressive. How has it been for you? And, the question I ask everyone is, what have they learned about themselves and humanity in this last year?
Well, I think some of this, I mean, I'm English, so I always have to talk about the weather. I think some of this, obviously, it's the fatigue of the fact that this has been going on for nearly a year now, but also in the first and second lockdown, we had quite nice weather. We had lighter evenings. You could speak to your neighbour over the garden fence. This third lockdown for us has been after in January and February. It's cold, it's dark here at 4 in the evening. Yes, people look miserable. They feel miserable. They normally do in January anyway. It's just a lot worse. And then you asked me about what I've learned about myself and about humanity.
Yes.
Okay, I'll start with the big stuff. I mean, I think it's such a mixed bag, isn't it? Because there's some real causes for optimism, I think. I think if we look globally, particularly say the Oxford vaccine and the ambition to share that globally and to do that at cost, etc. There's really there are opportunities for us to work together, to value care, to value the health sector better than we have, to recognise that global problems affect all of us and to be less nationalistic. But there's the opposite of that too. And I think the lessons about humanity run in either direction. And I imagine a bit later on we might talk about gender and leadership and COVID. So I won't go into that here, but I do think we've probably seen some of the best and some of the worst in terms of the global side. Um, and personally, I am an odd creature in that I think I'm an outgoing introvert. So I'm talk a lot, enjoy being around people, but I actually kind of get my energy from time on my own, probably like a lot of academics. I like to sit down, write, think. And so I would have thought that I was extremely well built for this crisis, but actually at this point, I would just love to go out dancing with my friends more than anything. So I think I've learned that I am less of an introvert than I probably thought.
Yeah. Do you think when this is over, there'll be kind of, end of prohibition style parties and people will go out and go wild?
I think so, and I think there's a tension with that, isn't there? In that we've got to be able to afford to do it. So I think the demand will be there, and then it's going to be a question of whether the economy is going to be able to sustain it. But I think any of us who haven't lost our jobs, we've got a moral imperative to go out there and really enjoy ourselves and spend money and boost the economy.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your research. What are you working right now? And, more broadly, how did you get interested in the area that I know you best for, because we are kind of working on stuff together there, which is gender and leadership.
Yeah, so I'm a political scientist, but the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which I direct, is where I work. And my boss is Julia Gillard, the former Australia Prime Minister. We're an interdisciplinary organisation. So I'm a political scientist, but I work with colleagues from all different kinds of backgrounds. And my research covers political participation and representation more broadly. And about half of my research is on gender. But what got me really interested in gender, I think, was when I was studying as an undergraduate. I began to realise that the way, this was quite some time ago now, that the way political issues were talked about seemed to me to be missing a lot of the story. For example, things like domestic violence or childcare were not really part of the policy discussions that we had at that time, much more now. And I think I sort of became aware of what we now would call the default male perspective. And I've read a lot of feminist texts and took some feminist courses and met some really inspirational women who would have been part of the second wave of feminism, really radical women who at that time were in late middle age. And that really inspired me to think, actually, I'm not imagining this phenomenon of what seems to be women's issues being marginalized, and that's something we can do about it. So that's really what got me interested in these questions.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more about these different waves of feminism, because I think, you know, when you mention the word feminism, to most people, whether they're male or female, whether they see themselves as feminists or not, there's so many different interpretations of the term. You know, what do you see as the different kind of stages or phases of the movement, and how is the typical feminist today, if there is such a thing, different from one in, like, you know, 90s, 80s, 60s?
Well, I suppose the historians of feminism would dispute the fact that these waves really are as distinct as we describe them. But I think it is a useful framework to think about. And we think about the first wave as the campaigns for women's suffrage and for the vote. And those women were interested in lots of other things, not just suffrage. Suffrage they thought was the gateway. But then we see a decline, at least in the kind of scale of activism and feminist activism, until in the 60s and 70s, as part of the new social movements, women really got active again and wanting to make radical change. And it's those women who taught me when I was an undergraduate who really inspired me. And then I think we went through a period when I was starting in my professional life of some retrenchment. I don't know if you remember, Thomas, but you know, kind of the lad culture that was fashionable at that time to some extent. And there was, feminism often is a dirty word, and I think it was more the case at that time. Young women didn't necessarily identify with that word. I felt that I was an outlier. And then now it's fantastic to see a real resurgence in interest, and lots of young women, and critically, what I think is different from what I remember when I was younger, young men too, describing themselves as feminists with ease, understanding the issues, taking them seriously. So there's, you know, another resurgence. And of course, feminism's always been characterized by division between different political perspectives, and that's just true now as ever. But I think there is this real energy around feminism today, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. As you were talking, you know, you reminded me. There's a tweet that I often use in my classes from Existential Comics, you know, on Twitter, and I think it's quite funny, but also quite accurate. It says, "Feminists in the '60s, quote, will create societies without men, abolish marriage, and use technology to free women from childbirth," unquote. A feminist today, quote, "please use correct pronouns," unquote. A reply guy today, quote, "whoa, modern feminists are so radical. Earlier feminists were okay, but now they've taken things too far." And I guess it's because they found that a lot of progress has been achieved, maybe, and then now you're infringing into people's privileges to a point that they find uncomfortable, and there is pushback. What do you think about the pushback that, you know, we see
I think
today?
the pushback probably worse in the
Was
60s and 70s than it is now. I mean, I always have to sort of remind myself, my mum did chemistry as a degree, and a few years before she did it, there was a cap on the proportion of women who could take those kind of degrees in many countries, because it was a waste of money. You know, only 5% women might be allowed to take chemistry, for example. We forget the resistance those women faced as they entered different professions and education was absolutely fierce. And when we think, the idea that you would say, oh, you know, today they've just gone too far. As the tweet really describes, actually the demands were probably far more radical then in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the research, and there's a lot of work, great resources. I'll share the link also to the Institute, because there are all these resources of papers and data on how the pandemic has impacted women at work, or female workers, not just leaders, but also employees. So what have been some of the highlights that you found, and, you know, what does some of the data show?
Yeah, I suppose in many ways it's lowlights in that, Thomas, you've already mentioned, we have made a lot of progress. There's still a long way to go to reach gender equality around the world, but we have made a lot of progress with women's movement into higher education, paid employment, and gradually across various different sectors into leadership positions. But what we can see has been happening with the COVID crisis is that women have been affected disproportionately compared to men. There are a couple of reasons for that. One of them, the obvious one, is when childcare has been unavailable, where schools and nurseries and other childcare providers haven't been available, a disproportionate burden of that has been taken on by women. Now, I think there are also a number of men who didn't previously do much childcare who will have been more active. And I think there are some positive lessons we can learn from that. But there has been a real burden taken particularly by women, and that's affected their ability to stay in the workplace, and it will affect their ability to progress going forward. We know, particularly in the US, that more women have completely left the paid economy as a result of this crisis. Now, we've got one study going on run by my colleague Rose Cook at the Institute, looking at government responses to the COVID crisis and trying to see which kinds of protection schemes are actually going to be better for women in the long term. So she's monitoring what's the variety of different furlough schemes or other kind of employment protection schemes, and then looking forward, actually, what does that do in terms of maintaining women's position in the workforce? But we'll know in the future the answers to that. But there are other factors at work too, that we know women more often employed in retail, more often employed in hospitality. Those are sectors that have been enormously badly hit. And we also know, if we think about hierarchies of paid work, that women are much more likely to be in insecure, low-paid jobs. Again, those are the ones that have been hit. And then 70% in many countries of the healthcare workforce are women. So women have also been at the front line at the same time, economically and in terms of the response. So there are lots of different ways in which women have been hit. And one of the things that really worries us at the Institute, which we are looking at, is we know lots of firms are unfortunately going to make significant redundancies. How are they going to evaluate the performance of colleagues over this period? And are they going to ensure that those individuals who had to take on extra childcare burdens, for example, actually are not penalised for that when those decisions are made? And that will also affect promotion decisions, but obviously the redundancy decisions are those that are going to have the biggest impact. So there's an awful lot to think about, and there's an awful lot of unknowns at this point in terms of how firms are going to deal with that going forward.
Yeah, so and obviously I guess the counterintuitive part of that is, and I would include myself in this category, in the beginning when it all started, you think, okay, everyone is working from home, conditions are leveled, opportunities to politic and manipulate and sort of brag and self-promote are taken away. It looked like it could be a leveler. And then also historically, pandemics have decreased inequalities like wars, etc. But it seems like we have actually gone into the other direction, and that maybe because the pie gets smaller, those who eat first get to eat more in comparison, right? So do you think there is an awareness of these issues? Because I've seen the studies that you did and your colleagues and then others. I mean, the data seem very consistent, but are people taking actions to kind of remedy it or mitigate it?
Really mixed bag. One issue is that the public are not necessarily aware of the gender dimensions of this. We all experience what's going on in our own lives and don't necessarily extrapolate wider. And then there's also the issue, there's a huge variety of practice inside different organisations. So we did some work with Karen and Box, the employment engagement survey company, and what they found in the UK in the last lockdown, number one, was that about 2/3 of employers had good policies for trying to ensure that their performance evaluations took into account childcare, but a third had nothing in place at all. We're just doing some work with them now to follow up on that work. So we'll see what's happening, nearly a year later. But there's going to be a huge variety in practice. And what I really anticipate is that those firms that manage this better will retain more of their more talented staff, will actually come out of this better. But I think perhaps firms that are under real pressure and are not thinking about these things could make some really bad short-term decisions under pressure at this moment.
So in general, the trend that a lot of people now are talking about when they talk about the pandemic and effect is, everyone says, well, it sort of accelerated stuff or trends that were there in the first place. And you did a great show, which I listened to over the weekend with BBC4 on the radio, on, I think it's called 2025, on how a lot of things that we would have expected to happen in 2025 happen now because of COVID. And actually, also read recently, Mauro Guigen at Wharton has a book called 2030 on mega trends. So it's quite good, actually. And he published it at the early days of the pandemic. And when he was asked, what would you do differently if, you had written it a little bit later, he said, well, I would have called it 2029. So, because it happened sooner as well. So talk a little bit about those main trends and what you discovered in that wonderful show.
That was a lot of fun. Our house mainly has wooden floors, and the radio producer told me that the sound quality was just going to be too poor. And so I had to do a lot of those interviews in my daughter's bedroom, because it's the only room with carpet, with a towel over my head. And I had the most surreal experience.
I hope there is a video. Is there a video somewhere of this?
Thank goodness. I was terribly nervous because I had to interview Eric Schmidt for this podcast, the former CEO of Google, which, quite significantly above my pay grade, with a towel over my head in this room. And it was extremely memorable, but absolutely fascinating. And I think that, again, we have the acceleration is clear in terms of the costs to many organizations of sustaining the level of staff commitment in very expensive city centers. The rational argument for peeling some of that back was there before. The technology was there, but it hadn't necessarily been brought in place in every organization. And that's just been absolutely, as you know, accelerated beyond belief. And I think, again, that has real opportunities, but also real threats. And I'm thinking back to your point previously about, well, that's a great leveler. Now everybody can work from home. Well, actually, what happens if one of the possibilities is that we have these very scaled back headquarters in big global cities, and then suburban hubs in much cheaper parts of various different countries, and then home workers. We could end up with the workforce tiered in such a way it's actually less equal than it is now. We already have a flexibility stigma in the workplace. People who work part-time tend not to get promoted, tend not to be considered to be motivated to succeed. We could end up actually accelerating that if it's those whose faces are seen in the narrow down headquarters rather than those in the suburban hubs. So, or it could be the most wonderful opportunity for people who don't want to travel twice a week to, internationally, to be able to take on senior leadership roles and do a brilliant job and demonstrate it can be done. So there's going to need to be a lot of imagination around actually thinking past the presenteeism, which has been the norm, and promoting the people who come to mind easily because you've had a coffee with them, versus the people who've done a really good job but are actually in a suburban hub, or etc. So certainly that pace of change is going to move much faster, and there are real risks if we don't think through job design and try and ensure that we're making sure it's meritocratic going forward.
Yeah, which takes me to another issue you explored, right? I mean, this difference between style and substance in not just business leadership, but leadership in general. I'm sure, and I want to talk about, so authenticity is the issue, but especially let's start with authenticity in the field of politics, right? It seems like not just in the US, but increasingly, mostly Western world, but anywhere really, we pay so much attention to whether people present themselves as authentic, charismatic, etc. in live television debates. So, the focus on style seems much stronger than on substance. And then similarly in the workplace, there is this kind of demand or request for leaders to seem genuine, authentic. And obviously there's the gender dimension there. One of the most, I think probably the most common tips or suggestions we hear to help women get to the top is either be confident, lean in, or be authentic, just be yourself. And so there's this other great show you did maybe a couple of years ago, exploring authenticity, or the authenticity trap. Let's talk a little bit about that and what your sense is.
Well, I mean, I think you summed it up beautifully when I think you said something that like, I can't quite you remember the phrase you said, it was something like performing in an authentic way. And that's that's really what we're talking about, because especially in the field of politics, there really is no authentic way to stand up in front of a crowd of thousands of people and just be yourself. That is a performance. You know, that has to be highly practiced, honed skill. And the skill is seeming as if it comes naturally to you, because it doesn't come naturally to humans. We're not designed to speak to massive crowds or whatever the particular artificial situation may be. And so having that ability to appear to make a human connection with someone you're not in conversation with is a skill that can be learned, and it's a performance of authenticity. And you're right, why do we demand that above all else? It's an absolutely fascinating question. I think one thing is it's a proxy, it's a shortcut. We feel if we can look someone in the eyes and feel we've made a connection with them, we can trust them. That's a very lazy way of really checking out a politician, because you're not going to be able to follow them around. Just because I think he's a nice guy or she seems like a trustworthy woman, that is not enough. And I think we are placing, I think at this moment, potentially, I think there are exceptions, in my mind, a little too little emphasis on things like self-restraint, professionalism, expertise. And these things can make people seem quite wooden, because in order to perform, you have to listen to the question, you have to take a moment. You can think of all those gaps when Obama would be asked something, he did not mind taking a moment to pause and then giving you the right answer. I would much rather that than the gaffe-prone idiot who doesn't think before they speak. But I think we have got into this situation where the demands of our political circus are such that this idea of this performance has become very attractive. But I think there are backlashes against it. I don't think it's not completely taken over.
It's really quite interesting. As you were speaking, I was, remembering almost like two parallel unfoldings or developments that were happening in the UK and the US, right? So Hillary loses to Trump in 2016, and one of the kind of criticisms of Hillary is like she's robotic, she doesn't connect, she's unemotional, okay? And then, well, we don't need to say anything about Trump. Everyone knows in the UK, I remember, Theresa May doing the kind of a dance, right? Dancing Queen, which then turned into kind of some minor viral sensation, and she repeated it, which I thought was quite funny, right? Because it shows us that. But then same thing, right? Like, oh my God, better, she shouldn't be authentic because it's just awkward. But then you have Boris Johnson, who you could argue is authentic all the time, or overly authentic. What is it, maybe, or is it that we ask women to be authentic, but we don't want them, or we are put off when they do, and then men can get away with murder, whether they are authentic or seem just to lack any form of self-control?
I think there is a gendered aspect to it, but I don't think it's just gender. It's also something about slightly more introverted individuals like Theresa May. I think introverts can be fantastic leaders, but they aren't necessarily people who are going to comfortably dance in public. And I think that gender interacts with that as well, because we know, there's a lot of research showing the double bind that women politicians can face, that if they are too feminine and communal and empathetic, then they're not strong enough to do the job. But if they put on a performance of being tough, then actually they're not really, their feminine side is underdeveloped. And we know that Hillary suffered terribly from those two poles. She could never do anything right one way or the other. And so there is definitely a double bind that women potentially face. But I also think this hyper masculine performance that we think of Trump as perhaps the pinnacle, but there's also Jair Bolsonaro, Putin. I mean, there's no shortage of these hyper masculine leaders around the world right now. And I think the key thing is that they're real dividers of opinion. It's not attractive to everyone. Now, Boris Johnson and Trump are not at the same position in the polls, but sometimes at the poll between this kind of more considered versus more, I will use some of your phrases, narcissistic kind of side of the polls. He's nothing like Trump, but I think he's further along on that hyper masculine scale than obviously someone like Jacinda Ardern or those individuals who take a very different view of leadership, and I would say a more empathetic collective one. And the thing is that it's not that the Trumps or to a lesser extent Boris Johnson's just get away with it. It's that it's very, very attractive to a niche bit of the electorate. And if you can be very attractive to a small but significant group of people, that can really help you win elections. There can also be a lot of people who find it absolutely abhorrent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is your take on the whole discussion about, countries being female-led, and not just female-led, but also, I suppose, women who display these more quiet, introverted, rational, calm leadership styles, managing the pandemic better? And I'm sure you could also find some men who fit that profile and did that. But it must have been very interesting for you to follow this discussion and what people make of that argument. And the big question is, if people are changing the role models because of this, is it sustainable, or will we forget, in a couple of months and go back to kind of the macho type?
I mean, my personal view is that this kind of strongman approach to politics, where you can't speak truth to power, where the leader must seem to be invulnerable, is atavistic and hopeless. And actually, in modern complex societies, it is not going to succeed. We have a division of labour for a reason, and being able to defer to experts when it comes to a real crisis like a pandemic is a pandemic is an ultimate test of how well those systems are functioning. And I think there's a kind of layer of gender to that, but as you say, it's a choice about how you perform gender. And I don't think that the option of the hypermasculine strongman leader is usually available to women, at least not in the same way. So you can think of someone like Margaret Thatcher, who did portray herself as very strong, but she certainly didn't reject science or expertise. And I don't know whether she could have carried that off. I think if we are sort of in a moment of fear and panic, attracted to the idea that one individual can just cut through the noise and fix things, I don't know if we would choose a woman to fill that role. So I think that's about our stereotypes and our expectations. And then I think if we think about leadership styles, if you look around the world, we can think of the women who seem, at least, in terms of fatalities, leading countries that the fatalities are much lower. You can think about Jacinda Ardern, you can think about Angela Merkel. But of course, there aren't very many women who are leaders of countries. Last year, when a lot of this analysis was being done, there were only 13. So it's quite a small end to extrapolate from. But the early research showed that there did seem to be something in it. And my view, it'd be about this performance. Actually, this isn't something that you can just make a lot of noise about. There is actually a real statistical outcome that can be measured. And if you don't think about managing risk well and listen to expertise, actually the numbers will tell. And I think that's what's happening at large.
So, you're making me think of what I think is the most fascinating and challenging issue, which is, generally speaking, when you're talking about political leadership, it seems like it's so hard either to find objective performance metrics, to kind of rank all the people, or for people to have the patience to want to get to that point in the discussion. Right? I mean, I'm even thinking when you teach students, you teach young people, and it must be very hard to, for example, get them to have a discussion on, was Margaret Thatcher a good MP or a bad MP? And let's, we can all watch The Crown season 4, great portrayal. She does look quite psychopathic there if you look at that. But then surely you have to get to the point of saying, what impact did they have in a country? And of course, you can't run 100 control experiments where you say what would have happened, whatever. But in a way, that's what the pandemic has done, right? We all have the same KPIs, and death per capita kind of tells you something, even though then there's healthcare infrastructure, blah, 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 etc. But it's from a kind of political scientist perspective, how do you feel about how tangible these kind of outcomes are, right? Is it like, it almost seems like it's down to either partisanship or a pub discussion. I like X, you like Y, we're both right in our own ways, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, even if it comes down to fatalities, I mean, one of the things people say about the UK, which is really, really up there in terms of one of the worst countries in terms of fatalities, is that we have really good data collection. So, there's no doubt that the fatalities are bad, but actually there's also a real level of honesty about those fatalities that some other countries won't be sharing. So it's not even that simple to count the fatalities. So it isn't a clear metric, but I think it's a much clearer metric than perhaps we commonly have as you say, in our normal in normal everyday existence. But of course, the political trade-off is against the economic impact. And I think in 5-10 years' time, we don't know how the different countries are going to be judged from this point. But I do think that putting the health and physical safety of your population first, I think that's what most of us would want from our governments. So yeah, it's a really interesting insight. And one of the things about young people in politics is, compared to when I studied political science, they are so interested. Numbers of students taking political science have really exploded in recent years, because there's nothing like political polarization and massive political problems to get people interested. So, it's very unfortunate that we've got global warming and we have all of these really serious global problems to face. But one thing is that young people are much more engaged than they were 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Do they know what they hope to do afterwards, after they study, or they go into all sorts of different directions? I mean,
all sorts of different directions. But I do think, people say this, and I don't know if it's a cliche, but it's been my experience without statistics to back it up, that young people do seem to be motivated to bring about change. And I think perhaps if you've got the horror of climate change hanging over you, it perhaps changes your perception of the world. If you think back to the 1980s and the kind of politics of greed and aspiration, actually there's no point being avaricious for all these things if actually we're all going to end up, unable to sort of inhabit the planet comfortably. So I do think that gives the younger generation really give me hope going forward. One thing you were asking about leaders and leadership and evaluation, I think that one thing our democracies do seem to have been very resilient at doing is error correcting over time. So we might not be very good in the short term, but in the longer term, actually, there is, the error correction can kick in. And I think it's not political to say from an academic's perspective that Donald Trump was the worst president the US has ever had, but he didn't get another term. If it had been an authoritarian regime, he would still be there. So I think we're frustrated that democracy isn't better than it is, but it's still much better than it could be.
Yeah, but that's quite interesting. And I'm not sure I can challenge that. And as you know, I'm not a fan. But my hypothesis would be that if you turn this into a kind of blind tasting, like wine blind tasting, but of presidents, and you have the last 50 or 70 years of presidents in the US, and you have things like the economy and major, like, even like wars, etc. So, we could, let's say that we pick 5 or 10 KPIs that he would stand out far less than people think, and that a lot of the kind of polarization comes from the style and etc. But maybe you're right. In one term, you can't do that much. It's also possible. But look, he's the most voted president in American history, if you add both of that. So, that tells you something about at least preference or tapping into some values of the time. And then I think that, personally, I think if we try to project into the future, whatever he did is less impactful than Brexit, for example.
I don't know. In fact, Brexit is. There was I voted Remain. Like I'm absolutely devastated by Brexit. But if you look at it, trying to sort of be objective, there was a demand in the population that was not, in my view, the politics. There was a lot of complacency on the Remain side. There wasn't, but people voted to leave the EU, and we've left. I do hope in 10, 15 years we might beg to rejoin. But I think that the fundamental lesson there is that the impact on the economy, the impact on our policy infrastructure, loads of things are going to be massively damaged, but our democracy remains intact. Now, I think the danger of Donald Trump is the other way around, that actually democracy can be quite fragile. And if you start unpicking those norms, democratic norms, you could spiral more quickly than we like to think. And if you think about recent events in Washington, you can see it happening. And so that's where I think I agree with you. If you to look at the usual metrics of the success of a president or prime minister, perhaps not. But if you think about actually our individual freedoms to be citizens in a democratic state, Trump is much more dangerous than Brexit.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. I didn't think about that. And also, and of course, there is a kind of reputation and image, which, some people think, okay, will take no time for Biden to restore it. And what I find most interesting in a way is how you can see the magnitude of the impact of Trump right now, because even though he's gone and he might be impeached second time, whatever, he is the number one factor influencing Biden, basically to do all of the opposite things that Trump did means he's still there, right? So it's like a nemesis and an antagonism that is there. And of course, it will really affect the way that the Republican Party goes, and to some degree the way the Democrat Party goes. Yeah, I was thinking more about traditional KPIs, and that, if you think about these two kind of more right-leaning or left-leaning, there's very little that you can attribute to Trump that didn't happen on steroids under Reagan, right? And if you're on the other side of the spectrum, you have to go to the 50s or kind of New Deal, etc., to find that, So, but it's an interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you go on.
Human beings have typically organized themselves. The individual freedom that we have right now is very rare.
Yes.
And to be able to sustain that is so critical. And I sincerely was one of those individuals that watched and thought democracy is at threat. Our individual freedoms are at threat. So all of those other issues, yes, we would much prefer an economy that's working better, et cetera, but the bottom line, not fearing, I mean, I know many people still do in the US fear that they're going to have the police come through the door and arrest them for not having done anything, but most of us can rest safe in our houses knowing that we're not going to be arrested for political reasons, for example. And I do think that Donald Trump style politics could undermine that basic value that we have in our lives.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right about, sort of the democratic institutions and mindset and culture, Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Let's talk a little bit about the Institute, and assume people don't know much, but I will post the link, right? So what's the vision? What's the goal? Where are you? Where do you see it going? And of course, I'm very proud to be part of the advisory council, and it's great to work with you guys. But yeah, give us a sense of vision and objectives and where you are and how it's developing and growing.
Well, thank you so much for giving the opportunity. So the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is chaired by Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia and the only woman to hold that position. And when she finished her time as Prime Minister, she wrote her memoir, and many of your listeners will perhaps remember that she was given a pretty hard time, to put it mildly. And she reflected on to what extent was the vitriolic reception she had in some of the media, etc., to do with the fact, the nasty nature of Australian politics, to do with the way she became leader, and to do with her gender. And she did a lot of research and realized, firstly, there was more evidence out there about how gender affects evaluations of leaders and our ability as women to become leaders than she realized. And also there were gaps in the research. So she came for a visiting professorship to King's for 2 weeks, and she proposed this to Ed Byrne, the principal of King's. And so the idea of the Institute is that we are a research institute, but we also bring together other people's research, and that we communicate and engage with stakeholders much more effectively than would typically be the case of an academic institution. So what we're really trying to do is bring evidence around what works to accelerate women's access to leadership positions and eliminates stereotypical judgments of women leaders as quickly as possible. So for example, things like implicit bias training, sometimes it can be useful, sometimes the research shows actually it can be detrimental. There's a lot of money spent on implicit bias training. what we want to do is make sure that all the resources that are put into promoting women's or gender equality in leadership are put into initiatives that work. So we have the institute that I direct at King's College London, and we just have a sister institute opening at the Australian National University in Canberra. And they're going to focus out on the Asia Pacific. And we've just appointed our new director, and she's Michelle Ryan, who very famously came up with the glass cliff analogy and did all the groundbreaking research showing the glass cliff that sometimes women leaders face. And of course, a huge part of our mission is that what we're interested in is gender equality. And so having insights around what's meritocratic for everyone is absolutely critical. So having you, Thomas, on our advisory council is so useful. And I'm always quoting your work everywhere, because I love the fact that if we could recruit people based on their competence rather than their overconfidence, women would be better off, but we'd all be better off. And lots of men who are better at their jobs would get rightly, justly rewarded. So that's a huge part of our mission.
Yeah, and so you find that compared to a kind of a sort of traditional research institute, you're kind of trying to reach out and bridge the gap between science and practice, which means interfacing or appealing to business leaders and political leaders as well. Is that kind of a...
That's absolutely the case. So we want it to be a conversation. So making sure our research is relevant. So as you know, we run a lot of events. Julia has a podcast. And what we really try and do with working with our advisory council and our employers board and all our relationships with key stakeholders is we try and make sure that the research we're doing is relevant and that it's produced in a format that can be used readily. So it's a conversation rather than us thinking about what might interest us and going off and researching that, actually ensuring that we're in dialogue. So I think we're very interested in the best quality research, but we also want to make sure that's really useful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How can we make sure that we're not, preaching to the choir and catering to the already converted around these issues, which is a challenge that I always find?
That's such a huge issue. And I think one of the key points, which is one of the reasons that I am always referring to your work, is that this is making sure that people understand this isn't about special favours. This is about making a level playing field. And this is about valuing what's actually really important. So when we're promoting gender equality, it's not saying we want women to have jobs at the expense of men. It's saying actually we want the best leaders and we want meritocratic processes. And I think if we can get that message across, then actually you can widen the pool of people who are interested. The other thing that's obvious to those of us who are already converted, but perhaps it isn't always obvious to everyone, is that the rewards of having a more diverse leadership and workforce are evident in terms of your product design, your engagement with your customers. Actually, the more diverse your leadership, the more less likely you are to have groupthink and that you are to come up with innovative ideas. So there are ways of communicating the message that are more attractive to a wider group of people, but we need to get better at doing it.
Yeah, yeah. Before we hit record, you were saying how, you feel younger people, younger generations, they almost find it very alien, the things that we're talking about, because they're naturally less prejudice or kind of more gender egalitarian, etc. Of course, there's always the risk that they change when they get older and they become more conservative of people. So, but do you think this will automatically fix things or help a lot, or is the case that we need to fix things for them so that the world is as open-minded as they are now, and we don't turn them into kind of naive and unpleasantly surprised future adults?
I think you're right. We owe it something to them to make things as equal as we can. I think, we were talking about the pandemic earlier, and of course we know more women have had to do childcare, but actually a large number of men who perhaps partners are key workers perhaps suddenly found themselves looking after the children for the first time. We need to harness those stories and try and... There are lots of young men who really want to be much more involved in their children's lives, in their family life, and really making sure that the environment is one that encourages that, so that there are parental leave policies that are available to men and women, and that we know that, for example, one of the reasons that women end up taking on the disproportionate burden is because perhaps they are earning less, and so it's an individual decision in the family. All of those structural differences will still be there for the younger generation unless we do things to bring about change, unless we actually educate young people about financial independence. And I think too often we are worried about talking to young people about some of the negative things that can happen in life: divorce, death, redundancy. Actually getting young people to think that putting all your financial eggs in one basket with another person is very highly risky, and you ought to have a career strategy for yourself and an idea about a combined family income, and that it's not selfish as a woman to work when you've got children. You're actually balancing a portfolio for your family. And we don't have those conversations enough, I think. And that's one thing that I'm really interested in doing at the Institute, is actually having those conversations about life planning and thinking, what is it you want over the life course? And not simply just following what we've seen modelled before us.
Yeah. Rosie, thank you so much for making time. It's been a real pleasure. I'm sure people will be delighted to see this chat conversation, and I'll share all the links and everything so you don't have to do it here. But thank you so much for making time.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Thomas. Thank you for inviting me.
Have a great week.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.